Okay, so in part three of this week's lecture, I'm going to talk about a couple of other conceptual ways of thinking about what consumption means in society. So again, I've got some links to some videos you can watch here. There's a link to Daniel Miller there, who I was talking about in the previous video, who's talking about his own work and his own orientation towards what consumption means. I've got some introductory videos there about semiotics that I'm going to talk about in some detail in a minute. And then another cartoony type video on the notion of bad taste that links into some of the stuff that I'll be talking about when it comes to Bourdieu and distinction. Okay, so I'm going to begin by talking about semiotics. And really the theories that I'm talking about in this section are, critically informed. They allow us to think about notions of ideology and stuff like that, but they also don't necessarily render people as cultural dupes. There's a kind of autonomy in here for people to express themselves, to have identity. It's particularly interesting to think between that kind of notion of self and social identity that I was talking about in week one, I think. How semiotics allows us to kind of have an interpretive kind of relationship with consumption practice that doesn't necessarily render us as completely ideologically duped all the time. So semiotics is a way of thinking about how culture, things like language, are ordered. There's an order to it. There's hierarchies embedded in it, and this allows us to kind of communicate with others and also to, categorize others and make judgments about others, and also to create meaning through objects and signs and things like that. So in this sense, objects have symbolic meaning that go beyond their use value. Simple example here is, shoes are meant to be these things that, keep our feet protected or allow us to move around more efficiently or whatever, but, brand names tend to then attach different meanings to them, whether you're a Nike person or an Adidas person, and, brands then kind of attach superstars to these things, and all kinds of other things then start going around what this thing is that was once just a thing to protect your foot. It becomes, embedded in symbolic and cultural economies around things such as cool and lame, or this year's fashion and being out of fashion, or being athletic or not, and all these kind of other cultural meanings are attached to the object. So this is particularly embraced by the advertising industry. Essentially, the advertising industry is a semiotic industry. The advertising industry is, selling you lifestyle and selling you affects and emotions as much as they are selling you an object, or at least using those things to hopefully get you to purchase something. So semiotics is therefore a way of breaking down those relations between, why things are made, but then the kind of broader social and symbolic meanings attached to them. So the basic definition of semiotics is that it's the study of signs. But signs here aren't just kind of things on the side of the road or traffic lights or whatever. Signs here, like the definition of consumption in this week's lectures, is broadened out to think about images, sounds, even things like smells and flavours, acts. All these things are kind of different ways of thinking about signs. Signs in this sense have no intrinsic meanings except for that with which we imagine them to have. So a sign in this sense, a coffee cup can be a sign in the semiotic sense because you read it in a particular way. The way I was just describing a shoe is that when you look at someone wearing a particular kind of shoes, you read those shoes in a particular way. You're not just thinking about those shoes in terms of that person's protecting their feet, i.e. the use value of them. We tend to interpret the sign of the shoe through the symbolic meanings, and that then pertains to things like status and gender and race and class and all these kind of sociological contours of inequality, because some people will have particular shoes and some people will have others. Some people won't have shoes. So therefore the sign stands in for these other social relations. You can see there, like, in terms of, I know this is kind of an absurd example, it's a bit embarrassing, but like in the PowerPoint there's like the start freeway and the end freeway. The end freeway one there with the kind of freeway with the red mark over it, there's a few of those signs on the end of the F3 on the way to Sydney, and for some reason as a kid, like, I don't know, when I was say 10 years old, I thought that sign meant no camping, because I thought that thing that was kind of the freeway there going under the bridge was actually a tent. So again, the symbols here are read very differently, and that's a kind of absurd example of me interpreting the sign there incorrectly. But more broadly, we can think about the way that we are oriented towards signs and the way that we're socialized. Our culture will have us orientated towards them to interpret them in particular ways. So the semiotics study of signs tends to break objects down to three levels: the sign, the object itself, the constitution of the sign, and the signified. So there's the sign, the signifier, and the signified. The sign is the object, the signifier is the constitution of the sign, and the signified is the meanings that we therefore then attach to the sign. So we think of an example here. So Lorna Jane, the exercise singlet there's the thing, that's the sign that you may look at to interpret through the concepts of semiotics. So what does that sign, what is it signifying? Well, it's the Lorna Jane brand, tends to be associated with these motivational messages. And what is the concept, the signified? The healthy lifestyle, being active and strong. Now, at least that's what Lorna Jane wants us to interpret that sign as. I'll show you in a minute that there's different ways of thinking about semiotics that we don't necessarily take on the ideological or the advertising or the PR meaning attached to consumer products. If we did, we'd just be cultural dupes, like the Frankfurt School point out. What semiotics, and particularly the encoding, decoding development of semiotics, points out is that we can interpret these kinds of signs in different ways, largely based on our own socialization, our own orientations, and our own politics. But very simply here, breaking it down, semiotics, the study of signs, there's the sign, the symbol itself, the signifier, this is the brand, that motivational message, and the signified concept, this kind of active, strong, physical prowess and stuff like that. So Ferdinand de Saussure and Charles Sanders Peirce are particularly associated with the rise of semiotics and, the invention of it, I suppose, as a social science. And I think Roland Barthes is a particularly influential figure. Barthes' book Mythologies, I would thoroughly recommend that to be read. It's again a really interesting social science book that's quite readable, written in the late 60s, early 70s, I think. It's essentially a collection of Barthes doing semiotic analysis of everyday things, including things like a particular brand of car. He looks at pro wrestling and all kinds of other stuff, and uncovers the different meanings through a semiotic analysis there. So again, that page there is a nice way of breaking down the different sign, signified, signify thing, and the different ways that these things pertain to connotations, to denotations, and so forth. You don't need to get too in depth with this stuff. We're not expecting you to understand all those definitions in the course, but it's just like a way of you to help you, hopefully critically engage with these things through semiotics in the future. So I think this is a couple of nice illustrations here of the way that a kind of semiotic orientation to the world can allow us to kind of understand how culture develops and how things become normalized, and signs and symbols therefore are really, really effective in terms of the way that we relate to things. The example there is, the Lego there, it's so obviously kind of reminds us of The Simpsons. If you're, maybe more a Gen X person like I am, where The Simpsons is kind of such an important cultural text, where, in terms of the signs here, you can actually construct some coloured blocks and they can remind you of a television show. The example there from Rocky, where the top one is from the movie, where Rocky's about to fight Mr. T, and there you have the typical masculine in-your-face aggression thing before the fight. But if you put a hand on Mr. T's face, it actually fundamentally changes the way that you would interpret that, and it looks like a tender scene out of a movie or something. So here you can see the way that signs can work in multiple ways, and it only takes the inclusion of something else in a photo, like the one where it says a hand changes everything, that will fundamentally make you interpret that social situation much differently. So semiotics has been really influential and developed in a lot of different ways. And Stuart Hall and colleagues, who are part of the Birmingham school that I'll talk about in the next part of the lecture as well, developed the idea of semiotics to a system of what they called encoding and decoding. And this is the idea that signs and consumer texts in particular are produced in certain ways, and they can either be relatively closed or open text. That means that they're more open interpretation, some to others. But once those consumer products are made and put out into the world, they can be read differently. So this allows the idea that as individuals, we will maybe read some things through a dominant or hegemonic reading, where we will just kind of take on board the messages that the company wants, so like that was definitely the case when I was younger, where I was kind of obsessed by Air Jordans. I loved the NBA and Michael Jordan. I just had to have Air Jordans, and it definitely was kind of doing an ideological reading there. But, we don't really do that with all things, so, there's a more negotiated reading where you might partly accept the sign or not. There's an oppositional reading where you'll reject the dominant kind of hegemonic signification and just do your own kind of more rebellious reading of something. And there's like an aberrant decoding where, you're using almost different codes to interpret something. And this is particularly the case if you're kind of doing a kind of semiotic interpretation of something from another culture that you don't understand or something like that. So I think a good way again to unpack it is that kind of those categories is through an example. Here you can see the Nike swoosh, that's a sign, the signifier, Nike shoes and brand apparel. The signified concept is kind of athletic, healthy, cool, or whatever. Now Nike's been around for a long time and they've attached themselves to various athletic and cultural genres for a long time. So, if someone's holding up a Nike shoe at you, different people will read that thing in very different ways. Some might go, oh yeah, Michael Jordan's cool, like I would have in the late 80s, early 90s, or, I want to be like Serena Williams and, let's go to the shop and buy one now. There's a more negotiated reading where you might like ASICs better, or you might think Neymar's a bit annoying, but, they're on sale and I'll buy them anyway. There's an oppositional reading, and I think this is the most important one, where many people would say, hang on, I don't associate that sign, the Nike sign, with coolness or athleticism. I associate it with sweatshops and exploitation. So, there was a whole bunch of politics, particularly in the late 90s, early 2000s, around the production of shoes in sweatshops, and that became a real organising sign for people to protest against that kind of globalisation and so that the globalisation of exploitation in that way. And there's like the more aberrant reading where it's like, where people don't really understand what Nike is or even what shoes are. So, what are those things on your feet, or why is there a tick on your shoes? Did you do something right today? Again, there's a bit more absurd and irony going on there, but, if you can imagine someone from a culture that's never seen a pair of shoes and they came into our culture, they would not be able to use the codes that we have to do the kind of legitimate reading of them. So encoding, decoding is a kind of system to think about interpreting signs and symbols and consumer products. Now, semiotics has been quite influential on the development of what we've called subcultural theory. But this was developed in what we call the Birmingham School, which began in the late 60s, and I think it only closed officially a few years ago, but was particularly influential through the 70s and 80s. And this moves away from the kind of Frankfurt School idea that pop culture and consumer culture is nothing but ideology, and argues that these kind of things are places of hegemony. Hegemony here is the idea that there's a struggle that goes on in cultures between dominated groups and dominant groups. Essentially, if dominant groups didn't allow some kind of freedom or progress for dominated groups, there probably would be a revolution. So hegemony is this kind of constant moving equilibrium of struggle. The Birmingham School argued that pop culture and consumer culture in particular was a site of this struggle, where dominated groups would be able to express forms of their own rebelliousness, subversion, their own relative autonomy from kind of normal mainstream society. The way that people did this, according to the Birmingham School, is through what they called subcultures. So the original ethnographic studies here that these guys did was on things like punks and goths, and there was stuff on football violence and mods and rockers. And these were groups of people together and expressing themselves through music and fashion in particular in ways that were challenging to mainstream society. Subculture theory is particularly related to that notion of mainstream on the one hand and kind of alternative on the other, that we kind of challenge increasingly today in a kind of postmodern analysis, I suppose. So in this sense, subcultures and participating in them is a way of finding other people that are like you, that particularly subcultural theories were a way of thinking about people that, you know, didn't want to be part of mainstream society or excluded from it. And they would find others that were like them, that felt like them, that were interested in the same things, and these kind of subcultural things grew out of that. Now, punk is a kind of atypical example, and I'll show an example of this in more detail in the week on youth. But this is a kind of way that a good example of thinking about the rebelliousness of this. So, you know, punks dress up with a mohawk. They put safety pins through their ears. They dress up, you know, with ripped clothing. They spit on each other at gigs and all this kind of stuff. And in this sense, participating in this subculture means there's these various rituals and symbols that you take part in that deliberately disassociate you from being normal and being part of the mainstream and that kind of thing. So this sees pop culture and consumer culture as a site of struggle, not necessarily challenging the system as a whole, but creating some kind of measure of autonomy to live within it. And that's an important distinction, what's going on here. The Birmingham school theorists are very influenced by Marx, but they're influenced by a whole bunch of other perspectives as well. And they're not as concerned with kind of, you know, the move towards revolution. They're more concerned with, like, you know, the ways that people can maybe exist within a capitalist society, but still have a measure of expression, artistic expression, a way of constructing an identity that isn't just kind of ideological. An important concept here to think about that is the way that, you know, the very practices that this means, the very practices that the people in the subcultures use to do this. And one method is what's called bricolage. And this is the tinkering with everyday objects and cultural products and icons, way of borrowing, recombining and discarding stuff, synthesizing things together to create something new. A kind of reinvention of everyday objects for them to mean something else. So an example here is, you know, punks started dressing in garbage bags, for instance, to express that they felt like they were being treated as garbage. You know, graffiti is a good example of bricolage, using the walls of buildings as a kind of artistic canvas. Things like skateboarding in public car parks is another good example of bricolage. That's reinventing a public space that's largely used for, you know, people going to work or people going to consume, for forms of leisure and self-expression. You know, in the rise of YouTube culture with parody and stuff like that, people use Barbie dolls, for instance, to make silly cartoon porn videos to criticize porn. So again, that's a reusing of, you know, Barbie and Ken dolls, very normative, gendered signs, and reinvent them, reuse them, tinker with them for them to say something else. So in subcultures in particular, bricolage is used to kind of mess with the everyday and to create something new. So I'll look at the notions of subculture a little bit more in detail next week when I talk about youth culture. And another way to think about this, and it kind of relates to subcultures as well somewhat, and I've talked about Bourdieu already quite a bit last week, but the way that Bourdieu talks about how people distinguish between themselves and others and their own groups and others, again, through these consumption practices. So this is through the social relationship that Bourdieu calls distinction. And again, here, this is the way that some people associate with, say, high culture, going to the opera, you know, eating filet mignon over a T-bone, or that kind of thing. High culture as opposed to popular culture, which is, you know, more mass culture, going to the footy, you know, reading popular novels, watching reality television. For Bourdieu, these kind of taste relations are very much homologous. That means there's a relation of kind of closeness with particular positions in society. I spoke about that again last week through that idea of taste classifiers, and it classifies the classifier. So in this sense, one person's fashion atrocity is another person's lovely dress. One person's, thing that they hate to eat, I don't know, something like sushi or something might be, something that another group of people really love. Importantly, though, that Bourdieu's relations like this needs to be understood that they change over time. So here, class, gender, race, ethnicity, and these kind of things are ways that people distinguish between each other, the way that they construct their own self-identity and their group identity. But importantly for Bourdieu, this isn't always kind of a choice, an autonomous choice. We often do these things as an expression of our socialization, where we assume and feel like some things are more normal, or who we are in inverted commas than others. And so, it's more likely, for instance, that blokes from working class backgrounds, will wear King G's and thongs. Not so much, again, because it's some intrinsic expression of self, but these things have been traditionally what happens normally there over time. They're more likely to be in doing working class jobs. So consumer products themselves become, part of that class expression. Bourdieu is particularly influential in the study of consumption today, and it's important to consider too that Bourdieu's studies themselves are a little bit dated. The distinction between high and low culture is not as important anymore, particularly as they've both become so commercial. And studies today tend to show that people tend to be consuming the same things more and more, but they consume them in very different ways. And particularly ironic distance is a kind of new form of distinction in that sense. The last theorist I want to briefly touch on today is Zygmunt Bellman, whose work has been very influential on consumer studies as well in recent years. The thing that's interesting about Bellman is, again, he's an actual social theorist that's quite good to read. He writes quite well, quite in a literary style, and he's a bit of a kind of magpie in the sense that he picks and chooses bits and pieces from all kinds of different sociological conceptual fields, from the Frankfurt School to Bourdieu to semiotics to all kinds of different stuff in postmodern theories as well, to think about what consumer culture means today. And you can see he's particularly concerned with the idea that people themselves, are becoming consumer products. That consumption, in Bellman's terms, has consumed life. And the consumers themselves are turning themselves into commodities. So we can see here in the way that we kind of present ourselves in things like Facebook and Twitter and what used to be MySpace and all that kind of stuff, or branding themselves on reality television shows, where we've always had to do a performance of self and brand ourselves in a particular way, for things like job interviews or even, when you're going out on a date or something. Bellman argues that this is becoming more and more the norm, that people now increasingly think of themselves and construct themselves as a brand and try and promote themselves through that mechanism. Echoing here the false and true needs distinction made by the Frankfurt School, particularly by Marcuse, he argues that consumerism has created new desires, new to be constantly keeping up. But the problem here is this desire can never be satisfied, because if our consumer desires are satisfied, the whole system will stop. So what's imperative in a consumer culture is the constant creation of new desires, constant cycles to re-stimulate consumer practices. And you can see this in particular, I suppose, in the iPhone. That people, it's a really good example, feel the need to kind of get the new one all the time, even though it just kind of updates details a little bit each iteration. And I include myself in that as well. So Bellman here is kind of returning a little bit to the notions of false consciousness, the impossibility today of living one's life as anything else other than a consumer. Again, this kind of has echoes of that idea of pseudo-individualization, that like choosing the next iPhone is kind of just an expression of free will, but really it's just an expression of the limited choices we actually have. Okay, I'm leaving it there, and I've deliberately concluded on that note as a kind of segue into the next section, which is about the politics of consumption.